Hello and welcome to the 2020 Virtual Think Tank of the National Institutes of Historically Underserved Students. Introducing WVU Parkersburg's president, Dr. Chris Gilmer.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the training on cultural competence for the Research Alliance on Post-Secondary Success at HBCUs and to the working session of the delegates of the National Institutes for Historically Underserved Students. We named this 2020 think tank Rise Up Again. Those of you who participated in 2019 face-to-face in West Virginia will remember that Rise Up was our theme. And since we cannot be together in person, we decided that this virtual event would be an extension of 2019 until we hug old friends and make new ones if the pandemic permits in Mississippi in 2021. Andra Day's spectacular rendition of the song Rise Up tells us that all we need is hope, and for that, we have each other. From Constance Slaughter Harvey, who I have admired all my life, to Luisa del Carmen Pollard and Marcela Garcia, and Chad Sheely and Lillian Gomez, and Ivan Banks and Trudy Hensley and Lionel Bordeaux, and dozens of other names just as precious to me in every corner of this nation. I have had the amazing good fortune of being lifted up my whole life by a community of people, a family of choice, who are my inspirations for a life spent advocating for equity and inclusion. And this year, we're adding new family members, all of us committed to helping this generation of historically underserved students and the next rise up and find their voices. This afternoon, we will begin with a presentation by Dr. Tamara Bertrand Jones and Dr. Latera Osborne Lampkin on cultural competence, but it will not be quite what you expect. When I was at Alcorn State University, one of my great mentors, Dr. Donzel Lee, longtime provost and former interim president of Alcorn, identified a growing gap between the age and the efficacy with technology between this nation's university faculty and its student population. The Rail Southeast at Florida State University began putting together the training session we will learn from today. At the conclusion of their presentation, we'll take a very short comfort break for the presenters, but we ask that you do not leave the Zoom or YouTube rooms because the break will be very short. The nice part of a virtual session is that our delegates may move in and out of the sessions as your own needs dictate. After the break, Dr. Osborne Lampkin will lead us through the rollout of an advanced draft of the toolkit that delegates of the National Institutes have worked with her to develop to assist colleges and universities nationwide in assessing their readiness to serve underserved students. We will pilot the tool winter 2020, 2021, and be prepared to share the results of that pilot with you in Mississippi in November of next year. I thank everyone who has participated in this tool development, and we ask you today to share your comments and questions in the chat feature, which will be fed to Dr. Osborne Lampkin for a response. We believe you will be pleased. I will then briefly overview the closing celebration, which will be held at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time tomorrow. At this time, I turn the program over to Drs. Osborne Lampkin and Bertrand Jones.
Thank you, Dr. Gilmer. I'd like to certainly say thank you all for having us today. Again, I'm Latera Lampkin, Senior Research Associate at Florida State University, working on the Regional Educational Laboratory Southeast, one of 10 regional educational laboratories funded by the Institute of Education Sciences and the U.S. Department of Education. The RELs work in partnership with educators and policymakers in states and districts providing research and technical assistance to develop and use research that improves the academic outcomes for students. I have with me today Dr. Tamara Bertrand Jones. She's the Associate Professor of Higher Education and the Associate Director for the Center for Post-Secondary Success here at Florida State University. We will now begin our session on cultural competency, and then we'll, as mentioned, move into our delegate working group on institutional assessment tool.
Thank you all again for having us here today. We are very excited to share some of our thoughts around cultural competency with you. I'm going to share my screen.
And so first and foremost, I'd like to turn you to our logic model and talk about our agenda itself. So in terms of today's session, we're going to have our overview of cultural competency, the evidence base itself, and then we'll transition into a working group where we talk deeply about the institutional supports needed to ensure that you have those things in place in order to implement your culturally competency-based, evidence-based practices. And so I'll begin first with our program outcome. And so we'd like to always talk about beginning with the end in mind. One of the things that we do at the Regional Educational Laboratory Southeast is that we actually develop a logic model, not only for our partnerships, but for each activity that we pursue. And so we think about the inputs, the outputs, and of course, our long-term outcomes. But one of the things that we want to always welcome and always remind ourselves that our outcome is always to not only enhance the knowledge of our partners as we're doing our work, but also to think about how this actually drives student outcomes. And so our session goals today, we'll review some evidence-based practices on structures and supports to support the planning, development, and the implementation of culturally responsive evidence-based solutions to enhance campus environments and student outcomes. And then we will have this reflection of our institutional processes and identify steps in program planning and implementation. At this time, I will have us to just take a moment to think about why cultural competency, and how can that be a lever to improve student success. As you keep that in the back of your minds throughout our presentation, we'll come back to this again and say, how might we use and implement the things that we've heard today to really enhance our student success and our outcomes? At this time, I'll transition to Dr. Bertrand Jones, who will give us the evidence behind the issue.
Thank you, Dr. Lampkin. So in order for us to make sure that we are all on the same page, I think we should start with the definition of what cultural competency actually includes. And we start here with this definition from Diller and Moule, and they define cultural competency as the ability to successfully teach students who come from different cultures other than your own. It entails mastering certain personal and interpersonal awareness of sensitivities, learning specific bodies of cultural knowledge, and mastering a set of skills that taken together underlie effective cross-cultural teaching. We start there often because the way that faculty teach and the way that students learn, sometimes there's a disconnect. And for us, this disconnect that we would like to focus on, I think as Dr. Gilmer started us off with, is age. Oftentimes, higher education faculty are significantly older than the students that we teach. And that has implications for the ways that students, again, learn. 37% of faculty are 55 or older. And that's versus 23% in the general working population. So higher education faculty, more higher education faculty are older than the students that we do indeed teach. This also extends to women as well as racial and ethnic faculty. Women make up 25% of those that are older than 55, and racial and ethnic faculty are 16% of those that are older than 50 or 55 and older. We share those data with you because the evidence suggests that the cultural divide between faculty and students contributes to low quality instruction, which we know impacts students' academic performance. So this is why this is an issue that we should pay very close attention to. And most of us want to be, not most of us, all of us want to be good teachers. We want to impact student learning in a positive way. And so making sure that we have cultural competency in the back of our minds as we are developing professional development, as we are taking time to better understand our student populations, will be helpful. So what does cultural competency look like? In K through 12 and post-secondary looks very different. The research literature, as well as the conversations, are at different stages in the different fields. But what we do know is that many of the key conceptualizations, it starts with institutions, and starts with faculty and students that make up those institutions. So as we understand cultural competency and context, I want you to think about these three different stakeholders, if you will, and their contributions to cultural competency in higher education contexts. Before we talk about higher education, it's important for us to understand how the foundation has been laid in K through 12 education. K through 12 education is where cultural competency, cultural relevance, cultural responsiveness started. The impetus was on creating a culturally responsive environment because it directly impacted how students learned. K through 12 teacher educators and higher education shifted to making sure that teachers were prepared to be culturally relevant, that they were, again, calling back to that definition that we agreed on earlier, that they were able to incorporate those sensitivities, that they were able to pay attention to or master the personal and interpersonal awareness of those of learning student differences, of the cultural knowledge and the skills that they needed in order to be able to be limber enough to teach different types of students, particularly students who were different than themselves. And so in K through 12 research, the literature has focused mainly on now identifying those qualities that distinguish effective culturally responsive teachers from ineffective teachers. In post-secondary settings, the discussion, however, has largely focused on students' cultural competency as a result of interactions in diverse higher education environments. There's been limited focus on higher education faculty's competence to teach diverse students. As we started to look at the literature, we recognized that there was this shift, if you will, from integration to a cultural consciousness to sense of belonging that was taking place in the literature. We start with integration. Vincent Tinto is a well-known scholar that is known for his work on integration, social integration, academic integration, but several critiques of Tinto's integration framework stem from the fact that he was calling for a separation from pre-college experiences for students in order for them to assimilate to higher education and navigate positively the environment. They needed to forget who they were. They needed to separate themselves from their pre-college experiences that might have been markedly different from what they were experiencing in college. His framework also identified a period of transition that students needed to navigate, which I don't think that we would disagree that there is indeed this period of navigation or this period of transition that students navigate as they enter and become accustomed to higher education and the ways of being in college. Tinto's framework also called for an integration into the academic and social subsystems of their campuses. He mainly focused or put the emphasis on students in that it was their responsibility to become involved and integrated into campus. Instead of the institutions instead of calling for the responsibility on the institutions. So we now know that Tinto's framework was limited in that the impetus for cultural competency was framed from the student's perspective, that all of the work, so to speak, was coming from the student. And we know that that is not the case and should not be the case in higher education. That institutions have a very strong and important commitment to cultural competency. So we've moved from integration, where students needed to insert themselves and figure it out, how to become integrated in these environments, to a cultural consciousness and sense of belonging. And these ideas suggest that students, again, disassociate from their cultural communities and adopt higher education values and norms, particularly related to, um, for instance, if students come from a first generation college student may be completely unfamiliar with how to communicate with a professor. And we are expecting students to come into an environment that is very different from their home environments and to just know what to do. And I think you all would agree with me that this is unfair for the student and removes much of the responsibility from the higher education institution. This particular understanding also disproportionately focuses on measuring the frequency of student behavior in the sense of how often do students reach out? How often do students take responsibility to become integrated into the environments? And the little emoji there, the thinking, questioning emoji, is kind of how many of us started to view Tinto's integration theory. And there were lots of gaps for this was not as applicable for all student groups. So cultural consciousness views of college success centered on several different ideas. One is the cultural validation, in the sense that we wanted to make sure that students understood that their different backgrounds and identities were actually validated and celebrated in college, that there was cultural integrity, that colleges were providing culturally relevant programs and practices that intentionally engage students' cultural backgrounds, that they no longer had to shed those identities and those perspectives that were counter or different than what they were encountering in college. This integration was reframed in the sense that it wasn't just academic and social, but there were cultural elements that were integrated into the spaces of the colleges and universities, into curricula, into programs and practices and other activities. This cultural consciousness also helped us to better understand a sense of belonging. So we've gone from the responsibility being on the student to integrate themselves into the college environment, to recognizing that higher education institutions have responsibility for cultivating environments that welcome students of diverse backgrounds, to now developing a sense of belonging. So this for me is the difference between diversity in numbers versus inclusion. And the sense of belonging here connects to the student's psychological sense of connection to their campus community. How are the students interpreting that connection? How do they see for themselves? How do they see themselves in the community and as a part of the community? And research has shown that sense of belonging is a significant predictor of student success. One of the models, if you will, that we think is important to consider here is the culturally engaging campus environments. And culturally engaging campus environments is based on 10 major tenets. And it recognizes that there are both external influences, individual influences, pre-college inputs that students come to college with, along with their individual understandings, their sense of belonging, academic dispositions, and their academic performance that contribute to their college success. So let's talk a little bit about what some of those culturally engaging campus environments include. There's a difference between cultural relevance and cultural responsiveness. Cultural relevance measures the degree to which students' campus environments are relevant to their cultural backgrounds and identities. On the other hand, cultural responsiveness is the measurement or the extent to which campuses respond to the needs of culturally diverse student populations. We can talk about the distinctions between the two. So one is the institution relevant, or is the campus environment relevant to students, but then also is it responsive? And those are two different measures. And colleges or campuses can measure differently on both of those measures. The culturally engaging campus environment model speaks to students' access to culturally engaging environments, and those are positively correlated with their individual influences, meaning that the students' engagement of the campus environment contributes to their sense of belonging. It contributes to their academic self-efficacy, where the students feel as though they are capable of success in the college environment. It also contributes positively to their motivation to be successful in college, and their intent to persist. If all of these things, if students are not experiencing this sense of belonging or this cultural responsiveness from their environments, that can have negative implications for their academic performance. So what are some of the indicators of cultural relevance? And remember that cultural relevance was the degree to which students' campus environments are relevant to their cultural backgrounds and identities. So cultural familiarity. Cultural familiarity is indicated by students have an opportunity to interact with faculty and staff and peers who share and understand their similar backgrounds and experiences. Culturally relevant knowledge describes students' opportunity to cultivate or sustain and increase their knowledge of their community of origin in college. And this has implications, again, for their positive college experience that, again, contributes to their positive success outcomes. Students have an opportunity for cultural community service to give back to their communities and make a positive impact on the community. Opportunities for meaningful cross-cultural engagement. Students here, for this particular indicator, students have the ability to interact in meaningful ways in cross-cultural engagement activities. And then finally, the culturally validating environments, in that we are validating students' cultural knowledge, their backgrounds, and identities. So why is this important, and how does this necessarily relate to, actually, before we go there, let's talk about some of the indicators of cultural responsiveness. Remember that cultural responsiveness is the extent to which campuses respond to the needs of culturally diverse students. So what are some of those indicators of cultural responsiveness? One, a collectivist cultural orientation. And this collectivist cultural orientation is where students are provided an opportunity to work with other students. They're exposed to students who are more, because of their exposure to other students, they are more likely to succeed. Humanized educational environments happens when students encounter a campus environment that is committed to, that cares about them, and develops meaningful relationships with them they are more likely to be successful. The proactive philosophies center around the likelihood for success and degree attainment when faculty and staff ensure that diverse students have the information and the support that they need. So these aspects or these indicators of cultural responsiveness are at the institutional level. These are philosophies or orientations of mindsets, if you will, organizational mindsets. Lastly, the availability of holistic support is the extent to which institutions provide at least one faculty or staff member to support students in a holistic way. So what does all of this mean for us as it relates to understanding cultural competency? What are some of the implications, if you will, for us? And particularly, how does this connect to age and the aging population of higher education faculty? So a couple of implications. So we recognize the need to build frameworks that are used to build programs, initiatives, and events that are relevant, that are both relevant and responsive to the cultural identities of students and are most likely to cultivate that sense of belonging. Mucius, who developed this framework, also suggests that tools for campus environments be developed to assess those environments and to help campuses get a sense of where they are and how far they have to go in order to meet their own goals of creating a sense of belonging in students. Okay, so now that we talked about that, what does this actually mean related to age? And I think Dr. Osborne Lampkin is going to lead us in some reflective questions about how we can make sense of this in our institutions.
Thank you, Dr. Bertrand Jones. And so if we think about the institutional context, so one of the things that we're going to use our chat box, as we've indicated, and we're going to throw some questions and have us think about in this context, now that we have this grounding and this background, what does this look like for us as institutions? Dr. Bertrand Jones, can you advance the slide, please? Thank you.
Yeah.
So let's think about cultural competency and student success and thinking about this in our context. So as we think about this disconnect between technology and our ability to support our students in doing that, have we measured that? And how do we measure that? And once we start to measure that, what are our outcome measures for administrators, for faculty, for instructors, or for students? So thinking back with our context, we've said that we've had this disconnect, and having that disconnect, what are some things that we might begin to measure? We're looking at the chat box.
We do have a question.
Mhm.
What are the specific implications of this research for underserved students?
Dr. Bertrand Jones?
Mm-hmm. I think that the takeaway for me, particularly for underserved students, is in the two main relevance and responsiveness categories. So thinking about how have we designed our campuses? Are there programs, services, faculty, staff, students, administrators who represent the various backgrounds of our students that we are serving? How do students see themselves as a part of the institution? This is the institution being proactive in taking a very good look at who are we? Who are our students? And are we representing our students well? The second piece of that is related to the responsiveness. So perhaps students change. Perhaps students indicate that, you know what, we would like to have more online learning. Let's use that as an example. Perhaps we would like to have more online learning. I think that's particularly relevant in where we are right now. Or less online learning and more face-to-face learning. And so being responsive, an institution that is being responsive to student needs would ask more questions about, well, what do students need in their face-to-face instruction, or what do they need in their online learning, and then respond to those needs accordingly. So there's the relevance piece of being proactive. How are we being proactive? How well do we know ourselves, and how well do we know our students? And then as students shift, as our needs change, as students' needs change, how well are we responding to those needs?
Thank you so much, Dr. Bertrand Jones. I think also this leads into our discussion that we'll have thereafter is that, as you might recall, Mucius talks about developing models and tools for assessment. And so one of the things that we'll be talking about today, specifically as it relates to underserved students, is a tool to guide that process. And so how do you, the question of who are we? Who are our students? And how intentional are we being about ensuring that the diverse needs of those student populations are actually met? And so that's a great question, particularly in the context of the work that we're doing here with the Institutes of Historically Underserved Students. So thinking about that in that context, those are things I would suspect one of our, hopefully the question came from our delegates in thinking about, yes, how are we measuring? We are measuring that. And we're doing it in the context of thinking about administrators, faculty, instructors, as well as students. Dr. Bertrand Jones, advance. The second piece would be, what data do we need? So what data are we currently collecting? We use the example regarding technology in particular, and we are talking about the age gap. So are there data elements that would help us as we think about who we are as an institution, who we are as faculty, as well as who our students are? What data do we need to actually collect to inform that process so that we can ensure that we're being both relevant and we're also being both responsive? So keeping the data, so thinking about the data that we might need for that process.
Dr. Osborne-Lepke, can I add something here?
Absolutely.
I think that that COVID-19, the pandemic, has provided us with an excellent case study here, particularly because many institutions had to shift drastically, quickly to online learning, and many faculty were not prepared. Many older faculty who had not engaged in online learning had to shift really quickly. And institutions had to be able to shift very quickly in order to respond to student needs. They had to, one, make sure that faculty were equipped to work at home. So in terms of data needed, do we know what technology faculty have at home or they have available? Does everyone have internet access? Do our students have internet access? Do they have machines or devices that they can do their homework on? So to me, this is the perfect sort of example of what data do we need? And oftentimes this was a need to be responsive from institutions because it wasn't quite relevant. Does that make sense? It wasn't, they needed this, we weren't quite prepared for this. So we had to be responsive to student needs and quickly gather the data we needed in order to be responsive.
I'd also like to add in that context, as well as we think about what data do we need, particularly in the context in which we're talking and speaking today, it is what skill set. So what data we had to think deeply about, in addition to, do we have the technology? Who has the technology? What professional development, what data out there will inform the levels of professional development or lack thereof that we need to also have in place. And so as we think about this in the context of COVID and more broadly in terms of technology, we have to also be mindful in thinking about those particular data points that also inform us as institutions and where our faculty are so that we can ensure that we're meeting the needs of our students. Advance, please, Dr. Bertrand Jones. And so we won't delve deep, and we just talked about these data elements in particular, but as you're thinking about data, you want to think about the specific elements themselves, as we just spoke about very briefly. Are there any data we should be collecting? Are there data that we are currently collecting that we do not need? And this is important because what oftentimes, before, and I must say, we should take a step back. What data do we need? What data do we already have, right? So making sure that we actually think about what we already have, because this leads into what data we need, as well as it leads into, are we just collecting data for the sake of data? As we talked about in an earlier session, as we think about doing these, being strategic and intentional as it relates to looking at our institutional data, is first and foremost understanding exactly what we're going to use those data for. What will it inform? So if we don't have a very specific outcome or a very specific link to how that data might inform our overall process, then it's not needed. And so we have to think very deeply about that before moving forward. And who's providing us with this information? I think this is very key. Given what we need to know, who do we need to talk to? Very, very important, very critical. And as we think about cultural competency, we have to think about it on multiple levels, as we should be thinking about all of everything, correct? So at the institutional level, who do we need to talk to more broadly? Administrators, faculty, students, and what unique perspective will each bring? Because again, we're not collecting data or talking to people for the sake of talking to them. We want to be able to identify the data element and what particular, who is going to be the informant, as we talked about in our last session, as well as the perspective that additional data will bring. And again, just a plug for our next session, the next component of this, we talk very deeply about, particularly in the context of underserved students and what we're looking to bring, we ensure that we think about each of those informants throughout the process. And so we have to be very mindful of that, and it's embedded in our process. Dr. Bertrand Jones. And then last but not least, what tools are we using? We've talked very broadly about, of course, this need, as Lucy has said, to have tools to help inform our processes. And when we think about the work that we're doing as an institute, we get extremely excited as relates to our institutional readiness tool that is specifically designed to assess whether we are prepared to meet the needs of diverse student populations. And then not only broadly, but as we think deeply about moving forward, as we look at individual subgroups of students. So we must think deeply about the tools that we're using. And we are hoping that we will have a tool that you might think just might be relevant to what we're doing today. And as we think about that, we must always recognize that there are potential barriers to the work that we're doing. And so what we're asking is that we go in with the end in mind and with that knowledge that there might be barriers. And so helping to identify those barriers upfront, being intentional and being able to also think about how we will address them as they arise, but being, again, using a very proactive approach. And so as Dr. Bertrand Jones talked about, she mentioned the idea of being relevant and responsive. So it's the both of them. And so as we're thinking about what barriers will we have as it relates to us as an institution or as faculty in terms of being relevant, but also what barriers do we have in terms of being responsive? Ideas and next steps and activities. And so we challenge you today. We talked very broadly about cultural competency and what that means, and to be relevant and to be responsive. But we also want you to think very deeply. We've just talked about the fact that COVID was definitely a case where we had to shift very quickly, particularly as it relates to how we interact, how we engage, this whole technology piece, as well as challenging faculty to think differently, institutions to think differently. And despite our ages, we had to get quickly up to speed, all of us, so that we were able to meet those needs. But I do think that as we continue to think about being relevant and responsive, we think about what are the programs, what are the activities, what can we do to reduce that gap or that disconnect as it relates to us and our students.
Dr. Lampkin?
Yes.
We have a question that asks what institutions can do to better prepare faculty to be student responsive.
Dr. Bertrand Jones?
That's a whole nother session. That I have a list. We have a list. I don't think we have time, but a couple of things. So one, in terms of understanding who your students are. I think oftentimes because faculty, and depending on how long faculty have indeed been a part of the institution or been a part of higher education, that we can become disconnected from our students in ways that are important to their ways of being. And I think about it for myself. I teach mainly graduate students. And so I feel that I still have an understanding of the perspectives that they bring. I'm not that close in age to them, but I'm not that far in age apart from them. But there are so many things that they teach me on a daily basis about their experiences of academia, the ways that their learning is different than my learning, as well as different from the ways that I was taught that I've been using to teach them. So what institutions can do, I think, to help faculty in this way is to provide a better understanding of who our students are to faculty before we engage with them. And some of that is a simple using institutional data. When Dr. Osborne Lampkin asked the question of what data do we already collect? Institutions collect so much data on students already that sharing that information back to faculty so that they understand who's in their classrooms, where do they come from, what were some of their prior learning experiences, what were some of the classes that they took that might have prepared them for our class, for the classes that they are taking, or for our class? And how might we be able to better understand their starting points to help them get to the end point that we would like? All of these data are available from our institutional research offices or our admissions offices, those folks that are processing transcripts. These are information that we have, that institutions have at our fingertips, but I don't know how much we use that information, at least that it gets shared with faculty who definitely could use this information to help shape their learning environments, to serve as a check for them to make sure that the examples that they're using are relevant, to make sure that the graphics that they are using, the emojis that they are using in their presentations, kind of like us, things have changed so drastically. Even this little emoji might even be considered antiquated or old, out of date. And this presentation is not that old. So uh, I digress, but using institutional data, sharing that data with faculty to give them a sense of who the students are. One of my favorite beginning of the year lists to read, and I can't remember because I want to give you the example. I'm going to blank on it. It is every year. One of the liberal arts institutions puts out a list of characteristics of the incoming class, the incoming freshman class. And they talk about, in many of the list a few years ago, they identified that these students never had a landline. They don't know what a landline, they didn't have landlines in their homes. They don't know what a landline looks like. They never had to do dial-up internet. So these kinds of things help faculty to know their students, get to know their students, and know what examples you might use in class that are going to fall short, um, what opportunities that students are just unaware of because they haven't been exposed to these ideas, what readings might be relevant for students. So all of the things that we hold dear can be improved by using these data and understanding who our students are.
I have a few more comments from YouTube. First, Dr. Ivan Banks wants to make the statement that his experience says age of a faculty member has little to do with ability to connect to students. And then we have a question posed. Are there any specific adjustments you can see needing to be made for a university that only serves students online and has never had a face-to-face experience?
I would agree with Dr. Banks that age can not be a factor for many educators, and it's not. But there are some who use their age as a barrier. Their age can be a barrier from reaching students, from being responsive, from being relevant. And so we bring up the age because in many cases, for many of us, that age has become a barrier, and not in a way that we are suggesting that colleges should only hire younger faculty. That's definitely not what we're suggesting. Our thoughts are connected to being relevant and responsive to the students that you are teaching. And so I would imagine that Dr. Banks and some of his colleagues are have at the center of their practice those ideas of relevance and responsiveness. In terms of your second question about the tools, can you give me that one again, Dr. Jackson? I'm sorry.
The question is, are there any specific adjustments you can see needing to be made for a university that only serves students online and has never had a face-to-face component or experience?
Mhm. Creativity. Creativity. There are so many things that we just do when we interact with each other on a face-to-face basis. And I don't know about y'all, but some parts of COVID have been very difficult for me because I'm used to just the ways of being face-to-face brain. So the interpretation of facial expressions, doing that in an online environment while you're missing the relationship with the person outside of that online environment, opens up the doorway for miscommunication or misunderstanding. Just my perspective. And so I think that institutions that operate primarily online are asked to be more or should be more creative in how they engage students, how they respond to student needs, how they prioritize relevance for students. And let me give you an example. So, as we have all had to pivot to online teaching, much of the physical presentation of me in the classroom has shifted. Um, I being at home in my home environment, students are able to see me in space in ways that they would not have seen me before. There was no way that a student would be able to come into my home office or to come in and see me in this space. And so this doorway has been opened, and that's for faculty and for students. That camera works both ways. So we're able to see inside students' homes and inside their lives in ways that we haven't been able to see before. And I think that opens up it definitely blurs some of our boundaries, but I think it opens up the door for us to be more creative and share our humanity with students and recognize the humanity of students themselves. But then how can we make sure that learning is engaging, that we do incorporate those aspects of our identities into learning, that we incorporate those aspects of our students' identities in learning? We're seeing pets and children and spouses and partners and other family members in the background. And they're all taking a part in learning because they're also able to hear and to see and to be a part of instruction in ways that we had not envisioned. And I think online institutions have, can have, do have opportunities to be more creative and figure out how they can be responsive, both relevant and responsive to student needs.
I think I'd like to add just briefly to that as well. One of the things that's also when we've had to pivot, we've also seen that even in face-to-face settings where we have had all of our support services, correct? Face to face. And so when we think about online environments, it's being intentional and thinking about every support that a student might need from, we're going to talk about being a kind of a student ready campus and what that looks like. But it really is about the intentionality of thinking about each aspect, even through supports, whether that be how do you ensure that the medical supports that you're providing, how do you ensure that each individual aspect of the institution um, is is also going to be, again, you're enabling you to be relevant as well as responsive. So I think even though in the online environment or it's online institutions, we have to also think about all of the structures and enabling supports that we need in order to meet the students.
Okay, the next question says, or it's maybe more of a statement. It notes the presentation we had yesterday for students in the West Virginia Community and Technical College system. And it says, perhaps we should acknowledge that the presumption that our students are 18 to 22 years old is not necessarily true.
Oh, absolutely.
Mhm.
Yes,
Mhm.
absolutely. I think, by all means, I think one of the things that we know about in our institutions, we are, when we think about age in the context, we're talking broadly because that's, in fact, that's what we were charged with in terms of the institution that provided, that requested this technical assistance. But we recognize that, definitely recognize that there's definitely variety and there's very diverse populations. And we talk about that as I continue to kind of toot our horn and lead into our tool. We're very aware and conscious of all populations as we think about the work that we're doing. You're absolutely correct.
Okay, and here's another question. People usually think of cultural competence related to race. And while that is important, what does research identify as the other major cultural differences or divides between students and faculty?
Dr. Bertrand Jones.
I think that some of the other cultural divides are related to sexual orientation and gender, um, related also socioeconomic status, and the relevance of these things. Um, Many of the religion, as well as, especially right now, maybe even, um, yeah. So, so those issues.
Yes.
Do you also see these cultural divides among students themselves and not just between the faculty and the students?
Yeah.
Well, right. Yes, absolutely. Go ahead, Dr. Bertrand.
No, so these yes, these divides exist amongst faculty and students, as well as students and students. These are not just issues that we see amongst one population.
Okay, are there any generational things that we can know about today's students that make them different than past generations?
Mm-hmm. So their access to engagement with technology and social media, as an obvious one, are drastically different as compared to previous generations. Most of these students, especially incoming students, and as well as some of our millennial age students, they use social media as to supplement their education. I was just having a conversation with some of my doctoral students who are not traditional age college students, who range in age from 30s to 50, and they are actually using YouTube to supplement their learning. They are engaging in learning communities in different ways through social media, Facebook, alternate text messaging groups that resources are shared. So I think one of the main pieces, we thought that it might have been initially relegated to those younger age generations, but we're seeing that students in general now are using all of the resources, all the technological resources that are available to them to help supplement their learning.
Another question, are there partnerships you might suggest between universities and their primary feeder secondary schools?
Definitely. So, not having partnerships with those feeder schools, I think, does the higher education institution as well as those feeder schools a disservice. And those partnerships range from the providing opportunities for college students or graduate students to serve as mentors and role models for students in those schools, to help with recruitment or to help demystify the process of admissions, or helping them to understand what is an undergraduate degree or bachelor's degree, what is a master's degree or a doctoral degree. So at a minimum, having a sort of relationship where the college or the higher education institution students can interface with the feeder institutions students is at a minimum. Then I think also advancing some of those, again, going back to one of our main pieces that we've been talking about relevance and responsiveness. What are the needs of that particular institution, that school, that feeder school, and what can the higher education institution provide for them? And I think having those discussions, getting a variety of stakeholders from both institutions in the same space to talk about what's needed as well as what resources exist, makes it more relevant, makes the tools that will be developed or the programs that will be developed more likely to be successful because they're rooted in what's needed and not what we perceive the other may need.
And I'd like to add that when we think about partnerships, I'd like to challenge our institutions to, as we think about K-12 and post-secondary and those transitions, to think about research or institutional community partnerships. And so you're thinking about expanding on what Dr. Bertrand Jones has indicated, is that you're thinking about how might we partner, not just to have that smooth transition, but how might we be engaged with our K-12 system around us throughout this process, so that we are pouring into those students and those students are pouring, and they know who we are. It's a win-win as well. So they know that Alcorn State University or Tougaloo has been in their college or has been in their school, their setting. And particularly when we think about, as we think about research institutions, and when we go in to conduct research, we have to be very mindful and understand that we are serving a population. We're conducting research with individuals, but we want to make sure that our presence is known throughout this process. So there are multiple ways in which you can engage with your K-12 institutions. And I'm sure we're speaking to the choir, but thinking deeply about how you do that.
That's all of the questions for right now.
Thank you so much, Tamara and Latera, for an insightful presentation. If we were in a room together, as we all wish we were, we would be giving you all a big round of applause right now, and you would be seeing everybody's smiles. I learned a lot, and I know that everybody did. And this is even more framing of the discussion that's about to happen about the tool. I hope that everybody will stick around for that as well. I'm going to ask that we take a short break for the presenters, but I'm going to ask you not to leave the room, if you will. And as soon as the presenters are ready and back, we will continue, and Dr. Latera Osborne-Lampkin will get us started in the next couple of minutes whenever she's ready. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
And we are back with WVU Parkersburg's president, Dr. Chris Gilmer.
Hello again, everyone. About 4 years ago at Adams State University in Colorado, we held our first think tank of the National Institutes. And it really was like a family reunion for me because so many of the people are old friends. And we declared a civil rights movement in higher education that's been growing ever since that time. But we came to realize that we needed to be more than just that. We also need to generate products that will serve institutions and historically underserved students. And here today to share with you a product that we started developing in a room together here in West Virginia about 2 years ago, and that we've been working on ever since with a small group of the National Institute's delegates, and that we're hoping to pilot in the coming months with several highly diverse institutions, is a toolkit to let students and institutions know how truly ready they are to serve historically underserved students. We are extremely proud of what this group has developed under Dr. Osborne Lampkin's leadership and facilitation, and she's going to walk you through the tool, and hopefully in the chat you will ask any questions that you have or give any feedback that you have as we're in the final stages of trying to get it ready for piloting. Latara.
Thank you, Dr. Gilmer. Again, so great to be with everyone and to really, it's been an honor to be a part of this process and largely to see all of the ideas and all of the thoughts come together to see where we are today. And so today we are here for our institutional readiness for underserved students, and we're going to talk about the work that we've done around this area. And so again, our acknowledgement and disclaimer. But I want to take us to our outline of our session. As Dr. Gilman has said, we're going to talk about, give you an overview of the tool. Then we're going to talk about how you can, what we call, put your mark on the tool. Then also think very deeply about considerations as we move forward. And so without taking a lot of time here, again, we all recognize and we know that there is a disconnect between, oftentimes, a disconnect between us and our students and institutions, particularly those coming from diverse populations. And while we like to have students that are college ready, we recognize that we too have a responsibility as it relates to ensuring that students, that we are what we call student ready campuses. And so this has been the premise behind the work that we've done, and we're very excited about where we're headed. And so one of the things, as Dr. Gilmer mentioned, is that, here's your declaration, here's our declaration here. And in ensuring to make sure that we move and are ready to be student ready, we have to think about what's a student ready college and what does that look like? And so we use the frame from McNair, and she says that a student ready college is one that strategically and holistically advances student success and works tirelessly to educate all students for civic and economic participation in a global interconnected society. I'm very excited about this particular definition because everything that we've been doing here, that we have been doing for years and that we have been doing over these past few days and will continue to do for the next day or so, really talks about how we're being strategic and thinking holistically about our students and what we can do to move the needle forward as it relates to our students. And so we did all this work with the context of understanding that while there are individual needs that students have, and this will be very familiar to us, we adapt this from Maslow, but we understand before we can get to having our student at this level of self-actualization of where we'd like them to be, that there's also some physiological needs that we must be aware of. There's some safety needs, the love and belonging, the esteem, all of those things. And when our group came together, even before I joined the team, this was the framing that our partners had as they thought about the work that they were doing. And so making sure that they were aware and having this at the forefront before we started to get into the quote unquote evidence-based practices and all those great things that we believe would help move us forward. And so there was also some assumptions about what we would have and what we would do. And so one of the first assumptions, and I won't read all of these to you because you were a part of this process, is that all domains should be asked a common set of questions to measure common variables, assumptions. But one of the things that I want to really point out is The fourth bullet, where it says, no campus is bound to share the results with anyone. Therefore, it can administer the assessment with no fear of judgment. So, this really, as we were thinking about this tool, we wanted a tool that institutions could benchmark their practices against evidence-based and best practices, but we wanted them to be able to do that, to assess their readiness to meet the needs of diverse student populations. But we wanted to make sure that they could do that without fear of judgment, because this was a what we call a self-study guide, for lack of a better word. It was an opportunity for them to look at themselves, see where they were, and then make next steps to move forward. And so the next component, we wanted to make sure that they could have this reflection process, not just individually, but departmentally and across the institution. So there is a component of the tool that we wanted to make sure that we had that would give us that opportunity for that cross reflection. And last but not least, we want to make sure that we would do something once we recognize that this is where we were. We want to make sure that we identify priorities for action planning and for continuous improvement. Because as we know, as institutions, we can always get better in how we serve and meet the needs of our students. And so, what we have is a guide for assessing institutional readiness to serve historically underserved students and our campus self-assessment tool. You'll notice that you see three checks. And so, what we've developed actually is a tool that we have three components to. So, we have this very broad tool that we can use institutional wide, but then you'll hear about, and we call it the three check, but then you'll hear about our second step back is as we look at particular subgroups, and we'll talk about one in which we've already begun to do some work on and we have a tool for, we start to think about what's a quick check. You know, what can we look at ourselves and in one page, 10 to 12 questions to see where we are as it relates to this population and how we're meeting their needs. But then there's a second level as it relates to that population, a more in-depth analysis of where we are. So what we've developed now is, and we're very excited about the fact we now have a comprehensive tool that we can look across our institution, but then we can start to delve deeper and look at each particular subgroup. So what do we have and what does that look like? So as we thought about this work, we wanted to make sure that we wanted to make sure that it's grounded in the evidence. So we use McNair's frame to think about what that might look like. And so we have four domains, and you'll hear more about how they map on. But the first is demonstrating belief in students. And here we're really talking about how leaders on a student-ready campus express their genuine belief that all students have the capacity to learn. Their values, their identity, the character are all valuable contributions that encourage student inclusion. The next was leadership values and organizational culture. It's really about creating an organizational culture where all people on campus are effective educators and leaders at all levels of leadership. Also, they're all empowered to make contributions. And these educators and leaders, they embody the values of leadership as a relationship. It's collaborative, it's diverse, and it's motivated and driven by the purpose of overall students. Then making excellence inclusive to support student success. Here it's really about how do we help colleges and universities integrate diversity, equity, and education equality efforts? How can educators work to build an intentional, supportive atmosphere for all students, that every student is respected, supported, valued in a manner to help mollify barriers to student success and engagement. And in this context, really is where we start to really think about, and we must clearly define those action steps to reach that goal. Last but not least, building student readiness through effective partnerships. Great question that was posed earlier today. What partnerships can we develop? Here we're talking about have you think about those partnerships. And this domain really is about how do we identify partnerships that will help us meet students' holistic needs, including challenges such as financial need, military status, family responsibilities. Someone mentioned, oh, we can't believe that all students are 18 years old. We also can't believe, as we think about our, um, our conceptual framing, that all students have the safety, security, and all these things in place. And so while we are there for our students, we want to make sure that we are partnering and being effective in partnering with community-based organizations, with nonprofit organizations, faith-based organizations, foundations, local government agencies, all can be valuable partners to help supplement our campus resources. And so we're not saying that they are going to replace our campus resources, but definitely supplement them. And so this is the framing that we use in terms of our evidence base and the domains that we have that's guiding the work of our project. And so, in addition to ensuring that we had an evidence-based framework, we also ensured that we took each of those domains and mapped them for additional support. And so, what you see here, what we think is perhaps the most unique component of the work that we're doing is that one, it's evidence-based, but two, we are asking for evidence of readiness. So if in fact you believe that you're demonstrating in terms of demonstrating beliefs in students, what is your evidence to show that? And so we thought very deeply about that process. One of the things that I also would like to know is that with the exception of one study, as it relates to evidence of readiness, the components that we think about in terms of being quote unquote ready, we focus on interventions identified from studies that have met what we call what works clearinghouse guidelines and standards. And really what that is, it's for supporting post-secondary success. So this protocol, it's not just evidence broadly, it's what do we know has had what interventions that meet S's highest levels of evidence are found to be potentially positive or have had a positive effect on at least one outcome measure. For example, degree attainment, for graduation rates. So we are very clear and intentional about the evidence that we are using to support the work that we're doing in terms of our framework. And we're asking institutions to ensure that they also think about the evidence that they're using. And so what do we have? So we have developed a tool together collectively, and the aspects of those tools is that you'll see that there's opportunities where you can assess whether there's some evidence, and well, I'll start with there's no evidence, some evidence, and exemplar evidence in terms of how you're meeting each domain. And so we have what we call our index of institutional readiness. And I like to say, I want to note that the thought processes that have gone into developing this tool really is reflective of the input from all of our partners, from our students, and from the work that was done at our last convening of the institutes. So for example, you might recall we had meets evidence, or I can't even remember, it's been so long, but we literally change our evidence, our index of institutional readiness, because we said, well, how are we going to measure that? And if we're measuring that, can there be some type of, instead of saying, yes, I have this and that's done, or no, I don't have this, there must be some way that we can think about this more broadly. And so you'll see that that's now been incorporated in the tool. We have our 4 domains that we measure that I just briefly gave you an overview of. But then most importantly, and again, something that came from our ongoing thought process was about, you're gonna actually assess this by looking at, does our institution adhere to laws, policies, procedures, and established practices? And then are our institutional policies, procedures, and practices flexible enough to address individual needs of specific student subgroups? So it's not just broadly do we have these policies and procedures in place and practices in place, but now we're looking specifically at each individual subgroup of students. And so that's a very unique feature, because we do recognize that our students have some commonalities, but there's these individual things that we must be very intentional about. And so as you'll see in one of our tools, it'll be a very good example of seeing what that looks like. And so in terms of assessment, using each of the 4 domain areas, we have our assessment scoring guide. And as you see here, we have demonstrating belief in students, and we ask what laws are in place to demonstrate belief in students. And here you see, we have you insert an example of a law to provide practice participant guidance. So in our actual broader tool, when you get the tool itself, we actually we provide you with an example using IDA and working with students with disabilities. And we work you through the differences of what a law would look like as it relates to this area, what a policy would look like, what a procedure would look like, and what a practice would look like. And so that's why you see the insert example, because we want to make sure that you understand exactly what we're asking you to look for. Then there's this area where we call sources of evidence. And so again, we want to make sure that if you're going to assess and say, yes, we're ready, we have some evidence of that. Well, what are the possible, what are what evidence do you have? And so that's where you're putting on that second level to provide evidence. But then we have guiding questions that enable you to delve deeper. And these questions are directly aligned with the four domains and are many of which come from McNair et al. And so we are using those questions to also make sure that you delve deeper for that particular domain and think about even deeper what that looks like. And then we also say there are some general sources of evidence of a campus ready environment. So these are examples that will be provided by our tool developers for reference. And so giving you again some additional examples of what this might look like. And then last but not least, and again, coming from us coming together and thinking deeply about this tool, we recognize that oftentimes we're asked to look at where we are and assess where we are, but we haven't allocated resources for that. So as we know, if there's no resources there, the likelihood of it actually being sustainable is very few. And so we wanted you to think about the specific allocated resources that you have, and then you have the scoring rubric itself. So that's the assessment piece. The next piece, as we talked about, the second component we really wanted you to think about, again, is to reflect. So there is this piece where there's a stakeholder reflection within the department. And so you're thinking together. So individually, you may look at this, but then you're coming together to come with a consensus rating. Okay, um, Dr. Banks thinks we're here. Dr. Gilmer thinks we're here. Dr. Bertrand Jones think we're here. I can't see all of the screen, everybody, all the participants. Um, but then where are we once we have our individual ratings? What's the consensus? Where are we as we look and talk about this and coming together and to think deeply? So again, this requires a thought process. And last but not least, and as I continue to remind ourselves, we have to think about our priorities and our next steps. And so we also have the guiding questions to help us think about what can we learn from our successes to increase underserved student success. Going back again, what support do we need if we're going to we're going to meet the needs of these students? But then there's again the action planning and the next step and the follow up. Very, very important. So you don't want to just have a next step. We want to make sure that we give you a space to think about what follow up is needed to get you to move to the next step. So this is this identification of priorities and next steps and moving forward. Again, one of the things that I think again is very unique about this tool is all the work that we've done at the institutes and through our post-secondary success at HBCU partnerships. We'd like to know that the work that we're doing, it's for us and it's by us. And so, yes, the evidence says there's all the evidence-based information that's there, but the look forwards really give us an opportunity to delve deeper into the on-the-ground practices to help gauge our readiness. So what are the possible sources of evidence? So you see strategic plan, if this in fact is where you're headed, is it reflected in your strategic plan? And so we have these guiding questions. For example, does the administration seek input from a wide I'm reading it, there's an error, a wide, diverse population of students who might not be reflected in the elected student government channels? Are opportunities available for students to do learn by doing while pursuing college credit? Really thinking deeply about all of these aspects that you can delve deeper in to have a better understanding and insight of really if you're ready for your student population. And one of the things that we thought about, again, the group at the very, very onset, they recognized that there were many stakeholders that were a part of this group. And so even thinking through that, We started to think about, as we think about students, let's look at this broadly. Is it, we have to think about advising, let's think about student government, the demographics, the Greek system, administration, who are those people? How do they fall into this process? Remember, it was a process that was a campus-wide intentional process to think to meet the holistic needs of our students. As we think about faculty, we thought about faculty development, the research interests, teaching assignments, all of these considerations as you're starting to think about, are we ready to meet the needs of our students? So having those framing as you're assessing, thinking about the stakeholders that are involved. And so again, as we talked about, I talked very briefly broadly about our broad campus tool, but one of the things that we also did, which we should be applauded for, is that we began to tackle our first student subgroup. And we started with veterans because we recognized that veterans actually went across all of our demographic populations. And so that was where we started. And so we actually began our tools, and we have two tools. We have our first check, what we call our very quick self-assessment to see where we are. But then we also have our second check, that little delving a little bit deeper to make sure that we are meeting the needs of these students. And so this is an example of our kind of quick check. And so literally, as I said, we wanted to have just a few questions. So it's about 15 questions that you start to question to see where you are as it relates to meeting the needs of our veteran students. And so just very simply asking, are sufficient resources available to link veteran students and veteran graduates to jobs in the community? Are sufficient efforts made to include veterans in all aspects of campus life? And so as you see, you have your scale, there's some evidence, there's no evidence, and there's exemplar evidence. And again, similar to our overarching and our campus-wide tool, we were very, very clear to make sure that we actually had evidence to support each component as we thought about this. And so as part of our the work and support from the Rural Southeast, we actually did what we call an AXCOREL. And an AXCOREL basically is a topic area that you provide a topic area and you say, can you give us what's the best practices as it relates to XYZ? In this case, it was, what are the evidence-based practices as it relates to supporting veteran students in post-secondary settings? And so part of that work, we began our work there. So that's not where we stopped. We began this cursory review to make sure, and what we provided was an abstract for each of those, an abstract of each of the articles and the evidence-based practices that were provided so that you could read and see that information. We also looked and made sure that for the evidence of readiness, we identified specific laws, policies, and procedures that you might look to. We identified evidence-based, we identified articles and research that talked about practices. We identified articles and research that talked about specific programs. And we also have an Appendix C, what we call our look for and delving deeper. But we also thought, as we thought about our subgroups, we wanted to also provide our institutions with additional resources that they can still delve even deeper. So yes, you have our tool, but there's other things out there that might also support the work that you're doing as it relates to this specific subgroup. And so that's what we have for our veteran students. And so looking ahead, how can you make what we call your institutional mark? As Dr. Gilmer has indicated, we have a very, very, what we call a very advanced draft of our tool. And so now we're thinking about what we need to do in terms of piloting that tool. And part of that process is that we're thinking about our sampling procedures. So making sure that we look across the United States, across our institutions, and also our institutional commitment. So not only do we want to make sure that we think about the sampling that we use to identify our sites for piloting, but also how we're now seeking to now get those institutional commitments as we move forward with the process. The second piece we want to note is that our piloting in the process has three components. First and foremost, as we do the piloting, we will have the institutions do the self-assessment themselves. So using our tool, they will assess their readiness. The next phase of that is then we have a set of questions. We have a questionnaire that's related specifically to not just the utility of the tool, but even something as simple as how we structured things. And so really getting at the substantive matter as it relates to the tool itself. So the assessment tool broadly that you'll conduct, but then we want to really get some, even the ordering of the questions. So we're thinking about all of that in the piloting process, or the how, we've reflected information here, this look for thing. We also want to identify as we pilot, get additional evidence. Again, for us by us, we think that the piloting of the process is also a very unique opportunity to give additional feedback. We've thought of some look forwards, we've thought of these things, but just think of the endless possibilities as we think about as we go into institutions, and they also help us to give us additional look forwards and information that we need. And last but not least, as part of the piloting process, we'll also do some focus groups with participants to also understand and get feedback about our tool itself. Protocols. We'll make sure, again, there's some tools that we'll be using to do that. We've started to develop these protocols. So the piloting questionnaire, we have a very advanced draft of that as well. And we've also started to think about our focus group questions as well. So keeping in mind the purpose of the actual institutional readiness tool. And we're going to think very broadly about that. And of course, as we think about our focus group protocols, the focus group protocols will be tailored for particular stakeholders and participant groups. So we will have focus groups broadly, but the goal is also to ensure that we have diverse voices as it relates to the focus groups as well. And I didn't know, and I need to go back to that. One of the unique things about the tool itself also is that we ensure that we include our students for a part of this process, which I think is so critical. So in our convening, as we've thought about these questions, even in piloting the questions as it relates to subgroups, it's great for us to think about these ideas, but there's no one better to talk to us for our veteran tool than someone that's been a veteran. And so we actually have someone that's a veteran that's also looked at the tool for us as well. And so we're really thinking deeply about what these tools look like. And we're excited about where we are with it. And I can say without a shadow of a doubt, it is because of the work that we've been able to do through these convenings and as a working group. As we think about our next steps as well, we don't talk about this, and this is the form that we want to do this in, is to also think about considerations for dissemination once we have actually gone through our piloting process and how we can move forward with our tool. Because again, the goal is always, and I continue to say, as we develop these tools, we want to make sure that we're disseminating the tool in a way that others can benefit from the work that we're doing and that we have, so that we can have a broader reach. Questions?
Yes, we do have some questions. Dr. Donzel Lee from Alcorn State University, he was trying to put a question in Facebook, or not Facebook, but YouTube, and it's actually limited to 200 characters. And his question was more than 200 characters. So here it is. What are ways that institutions are preparing faculty of international origin to support the institution's readiness for cultural diversity, especially when international faculty may have very strong cultural beliefs that may not necessarily be compatible with the institution's effort to provide for underserved students?
Dr. Gilmer, do you want to? So our tool, I don't have, we've not looked at that as of yet. So for each, one of the things that we intend to do is for each subgroup. So when we think about international students and international faculty, how do you become ready for that? That's something that we will devote that level of time, the same level and time and effort that we devote into thinking about our individual subgroups. Perhaps, for example, our veterans will take that same level of effort to include the evidence base around that, to be able to provide some very substantive examples and substantive evidence to support. These are the types of specific things that the evidence says that you will need in order to meet the needs of those students.
I think Dr. Lee has done what Dr. Lee often does, which is figure out how to take the conversation to the next
level.
The National Institutes are committed to defining underserved very broadly, and international students is not a category that we had yet placed on our list. So during Think Tank 2020, let it be noted that we came to the realization that we need to put international students and international faculty more on the radar screen to be considered in this work. Thank you for that, Donzel.
We also have another question. In the context of the HBCUs, to what extent do you feel it's important to build student institutional identity by providing a deep understanding of institutional history in the context of regional community historical experience? And can that be assessed?
Dr. Gilmer?
I would say that Mama Braves, as we call her at Alcorn State University, Mrs. Zelmarine Murphy, would be very disappointed in me and our friendship if I didn't point out the strong need for students, particularly at minority serving institutions, to know and live into the history of their institutions, because that history was built upon the sacrifice of so many generations of people who came before. So, like most colleges and universities in the country have introduction to college classes called different things that talk about critical thinking skills and time management and how to do your homework. It's a common practice at HBCUs, and probably something that should become a common practice at other kinds of institutions as well, to weave the history of the institution into the introduction to college courses. And so I think that's a lesson that all institutions can take from something that historically Black colleges and universities are already doing well.
Okay, so this is an overall campus assessment, and then there's one in particular for veterans, just to clarify. So are we expecting more tools for specific populations, which you might have already alluded to?
Absolutely. We are definitely, we definitely would like more tools. And yes, so as we've said, we definitely are going to look at particular subgroups. We've thought deeply. Actually, there's been, and I'll let Dr. Gilmer talk about this next step. We've already identified actually a next subgroup that we'd like to look at.
Yes, we plan to develop tools around race, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, first generation status, all of the different ways that we can unpack being historically underserved. We decided, the concept of being historically underserved usually starts with race. And so some people have wondered why we didn't start there. And the reason we didn't is, as Latera already said, we wanted to choose one that spanned all different groups, and veterans span all different groups. But we believe it's important to make race the next tool that we develop in a specific way. And then we'll work our way through the list. Prioritizing them all is important until we get a tool for every specific population that we can think of in our toolbox. And it's important also to note that we want colleges to be able to think by specific populations, but we really also want them to focus on what all of these populations have in common across the different demographic, cultural, and other factors, which is why we have developed a strand for individual populations and also a comprehensive assessment across all populations.
Just to clarify, how do folks get access to this tool, and how do they begin to implement it at their institutions?
As far as access, Latera and I made the decision, and we hope we got it right, that we would see who showed up and was interested in this today, and that we would follow up by sending it out to all of the delegates in draft form for everybody to be able to see in all of its beautiful complexity. And as far as implementing it at your institutions, we will not be ready to do that until after the pilot. We've chosen a very diverse group, a tribal institution, a Hispanic serving institution, an Appalachian institution, and a couple of HBCUs to do the pilot. After we get it done there, and intentionally the most diverse group of colleges and universities we could find, we will make as a group refinements that are needed and bring those refinements to this body at our November 2021 meeting, hopefully in Mississippi, if the pandemic allows. And after you all give it your good housekeeping seal of approval, it'll then be ready for free dissemination and use by colleges and universities all across the country.
Have you considered any other student populations, such as those with disabilities, in particular autism or post-traumatic stress disorder?
Yes, we definitely do have students with learning differences on the list. We can also share the concept paper. Many of the people who've been with us from the beginning have seen the concept paper for the National Institutes. But as a follow up to this think tank, we will share the concept paper with everyone, and you can see the specific populations we've already identified. And hopefully, as Dr. Lee has done today already, help us to find additional populations that we need to add to the list, but that population is already reflected.
So what are the next steps for your organization at this point in time?
The next steps for our organization are mostly around this tool, which is why we wanted to share that with you this afternoon. We've been sharing the Declaration on the Rights of Historically Underserved Students, which we ratified at our first think tank with colleges and universities all across the country for use in their diversity programs, from Phoenix College to Southern New Hampshire University and just about everywhere in between. And we'll continue doing that. But as we said, we realized the need to be more than that. So we will be moving into the development of a variety of tools. When we get this toolkit built out and up and running and used at colleges all across the country, and that'll take a while, we have expressed interest to each other in looking at the national accreditation process, perhaps, because we believe that while national accreditation, peer accreditation of institutions is very important, and we're supportive of that, we don't believe that it is always as culturally sensitive as it might be. And we probably will develop a white paper around some recommendations for the national accrediting bodies. Additionally, we are considering our first book project, which may be a book of stories on passing and double consciousness, written by historically underserved students and those of us who love and serve them, telling our own first person narratives of things that have happened in our lives. So these are some of the ways that we see the work continuing and growing as time goes on.
Would it be fair to say that in this toolbox that you're creating, that maybe the first tool is your measuring device? And from that, you'll be able to determine what other tools are needed?
Dr. Osborne Lampkin, would you take that one?
Absolutely. Yes, I really think that this tool will certainly let us know where we're going to be able to assess a lot. But we like to have a suite of tools. Yes, I think in our tool, I love the analogy our toolkit, because we believe that this is of one of the tools that we can use as we start to look at our population and to support our student population. So yes.
Do you have any time frames on how this process will go and how long it takes to know how effective this tool is and what modifications will be needed before you make more?
With our eminent researcher in the room, I wouldn't begin to answer that question, but I will be happy for her to.
Absolutely. One of the things that we haven't talked about is this idea of dissemination and implementation research, right? And so when we're developing tools, we make sure that we develop them with in mind of the population that we're going to serve. But in terms of the evaluation process, as you know, we will develop as we move forward, part of that process is to embed a process for evaluation to think about how we do that. And so we've not developed our quote unquote research agenda or a research plan for the evaluation, the full evaluation of the tool. But what we like to see, at least it get out for a couple of years, and then we can circle back and think about that. But we have thought about what that evaluation looks like. So we have thought what exactly we need, what we would exactly need to look for if we're thinking about this tool as what I would call it thinking about it, and when you talk about evaluation and effectiveness, you're talking about it as an intervention per se. So thinking about it in that context as well.
This is a labor of love for our students. I might point out that every bit of work that all of the people in the National Institutes have done over the years has been done entirely as volunteers. Nobody has received any payment for this work other than the payment we feel in our souls for the investment that we're making on behalf of our students. So this is a labor of love among people who have a whole lot of other responsibilities in their lives, but we're going to get it up and running as quickly as we possibly can because we see the importance of it. It's a work in progress, but progress is definitely being made, as you can see in the fact that we're about to do our first pilot study.
So to sum it up a little bit, you would say that this whole project is about improving the student learning process for students who may sometimes be overlooked or underserved. How long do you think it will take to see an impact in their classrooms for them?
I would say more than sometimes overlooked and underserved. Sadly, I would say consistently overlooked and underserved, and we plan to do something about that. I do think, like all research projects, they cannot be rushed. And nobody in the world is more impatient than I am, as my team at WBUP will tell you. If I'm interested in it, I wanted it to happen yesterday, but it can't happen yesterday and have the integrity that it needs to have. Latera, have you any thoughts about even the possibility of a time frame?
Yes. Well, if we want, first and foremost, we'd like to do the piloting in this one. We talked about this. If COVID permits, we've tried to be creative. So we'd like to do the piloting in the spring. Once we pilot in the spring, we will quickly, as you know, with this type of work, it's an iterative process. So the idea is as we're collecting data, we'll also think about making the modifications as we go along. Yes, that's what piloting gives us the opportunity to do. But we hope to, by all means, get everything done, and hopefully by the next, by our next convening, at the latest, have this tool ready to go out to our students, out to our campuses. So that's been our timeline that we talked about in terms of reviewing it, getting the piling done, and then getting into the hands of the institution.
So just to clarify, folks can still ask to be part of the pilot group? Or is that already decided?
I think we could take a few more pilot institutions. You know, a lack of ambition is never something that I've been accused of. So I speak things and make additional work for Latera. This is the relationship that she and I have had over the years. She's got to draw some boundaries for herself around how much she is able to do. But if there are other institutions that are really very interested in being a part of the pilot, I think we would be ill-advised to leave them out. We might even then do a larger second phase pilot, which is sort of the first phase of implementation, and more institutions can be involved in that. But please contact us if you're interested in being a part of the phase one pilot. We would welcome talking to you about that.
Okay, so for the last question, if I asked you to sum this up to tell me what excites you most about this opportunity, what would you tell me?
What excites me the most about this is something Latera said earlier, and I don't even know if she realized in the moment how profound it is. I wrote it down. She said the words "for us" and "by us." There are lots of toolkits and things of that nature that have been created over decades that are out there. And I don't wish to disparage or denigrate any of them. I'm sure that they all have value, but they weren't created by historically underserved students and the people who love them with historically underserved students in mind. We are doing something unique and different in the way that we're creating this. We brought the students that we're serving into the process of creating their own future. That's what's different about what we're doing. It's when I think that we're poised because of the diversity of this nation that we represent to do better than anybody else.
We are finished with questions.
Okay, then we're almost finished. Most folks don't think I have the ability to be brief, but I'm going to prove to you that I do. First off, I want to say that I wish we had all been in a really big room together so we could read each other's facial expressions and nod our heads, and we could have all participated more actively in this discussion. We are not a quiet or shy group, and I miss the fact that we weren't able to be together. But I was determined that we were not going to let the pandemic win and skip being together together all together. And I think that being in the virtual format, while it has had its limitations, has given us an opportunity to continue this work, and I'm pleased about that. I want to tell you that tomorrow's closing celebration will be a celebration. It'll be a retrospective of the work that we've done already, and some talk about the work that we're going to continue to do moving forward. And we will present the Generations Award, which is going to a very special family who I hope is listening in from a very distant time zone right now. I won't spoil the award for tomorrow, but be with us tomorrow to see this deserving family win the Generations Award. And I'll end by reminding us of what the Italian writer Dante said, which is the hottest places in hell are reserved for those who, in times of great moral crisis, maintain their neutrality. Folks, when it comes to creating a level playing field for all of this nation's students, we may be accused of much, but this convening will never ever be accused of maintaining our neutrality where the future of our students are concerned. So I thank you all for being here today. I thank Latera and Tamara particularly for the insight that they shared. And I wish all of you a good evening and hope that you will come tomorrow to the virtual celebration and bring your friends. Thanks and have a great day.